Of all the video game mascots out there, Kirby is certainly one of the most recognizable. It could be his simple and cute design, or it also could be all the excellent games that he's been in over the years. The guys at HAL Lab have certainly made a lot of those, with the Super Nintendo being no exception. Most of the Kirby games for the Super Nintendo were spin-off titles, with only 2 being for the main series. Those were Kirby Superstar and Kirby's Dream Land 3. Of these 2, everyone always talks about Kirby Superstar due to its fluid and innovative gameplay. Whether it's the fast pace, the innovative changes it introduced to the copyability system, or the strong variety of game modes, people tend to laud this entry as one of the best and most important games in the series. In fact, it was so popular that it got a remaster on the DS, which arguably surpassed the original. Unfortunately, this means that Kirby Superstar has overshadowed Kirby's Dream Land 3, much like a neglected sibling, which is a real shame. While Kirby's Dream Land 3 was less innovative in its gameplay, it was definitely tonally and aesthetically superior. Shinichi Shimomura certainly had a vision for this game that differed from the games made by Sakurai, like Kirby Superstar. This comparison has really prevented fans of the Kirby series from appreciating the aspects of Kirby's Dream Land 3 on its own merits, and I'm almost certain that the game would be viewed more positively if it wasn't released so near Kirby Superstar. It doesn't help that the game was released so late into the Super Nintendo's life cycle. In fact, the Nintendo 64 had already been out for a year by the time Kirby's Dream Land 3 was released. All of this created the perfect environment for this game to be overlooked, but it has a lot to show us, and I'm going to prove it. First thing you'll see when you boot up the game is a wonderful little cinematic that shows the antagonist of the game, Dark Matter, arriving to Popstar and corrupting the world. I really like the comic book presentation, and the music has this far-off ethereal feeling to it. It really helps to set the tone for the rest of the game. Then you get to the title screen, where you see Kirby and all his animal friends, who will be helping you throughout the game. Once you enter the game, you'll notice that it's divided into 6 areas, or levels as the game calls them. There's Grassland, Ripple Field, Sand Canyon, Cloudy Park, Iceberg, and the Hyperzone. Each level has its own stage select screen, which gives you a nice little depiction of the area you're in, and where the stages are roughly situated in that level. All the levels have 6 stages, and 1 boss stage at the end. The exception to this is the Hyperzone, but we'll get to that much later. Now, the first impression you might have when looking at the screen, from the crayon pastel look to the toddler music, is, man, this game's for babies. And you know what? You might be right about that, but trust me, that's part of the charm. This hazy faded crayon pastel look gives everything the impression of a dream or maybe a distant memory from childhood. Kinda like the things that you would draw as a kid, except with infinitely more talent. You'd imagine the kind of scenarios and events that were happening as you draw, and that gave you the sense that the drawing was more alive than it really was. I think this aesthetic really captures that feeling of childlike imagination well, since you're basically playing one of those childlike fantasies through this game. It feels very nostalgic. They also added geometric patterns into a lot of the stages, which complements the dreamlike and juvenile tone. In particular, the ones that are embedded in the walls kinda remind me of those shape blocks that you get as a toddler. Here's the first stage of the game. It would be easy to dismiss everything as simple looking, but if you look closely, you'll realize that there's actually a lot of detail on the screen. There's the hazy hills and sky in the background, and the animated flowers in the foreground. Now keep an eye out for that dandelion, and the blue butterfly ahead of Kirby. Did you see that? Whenever you run past certain objects in the game, you trigger an animation with them that has no bearing on the gameplay. In fact, I didn't even realize this was happening until later in the game, and I can see how you can miss some of these if you're speeding through the stages. This kind of thing makes the game feel a bit more alive. It's amazing how much time and effort the developers put into this game to add little details like this, especially for a game from this era. It's a real feast for the eyes. Here's another example. You're running through the levels and, hey, you can run over these little spiders. It's kind of funny and I find myself going out of my way to do this, especially because there's these creepy bastards in the game. Might as well try to cull them before they... Wait. Oh my god, did you see that? The white ones pop into a green splash on the wall. It's really bizarre and I have no idea why they would add this, but I have to admit that this does add character to the game. And on the subject of adding character to the game, have you noticed the music at all? The Kirby series is fairly well known for having good soundtracks, and Kirby's Dream Land 3 is no exception. It sets itself apart from the other Kirby games in its more juvenile sound, which really complements the nostalgic and dreamlike tone of the visuals. A lot of the tracks sound like the kind of things that you'd hear from a TV program for toddlers. That said, the composer, Jun Ishikawa, managed to add a lot of diversity into the tracks for the game. Let's have a listen. Quite a strong variety of tracks, wouldn't you agree? They all have different but memorable melodies, and although a lot of the tracks get reused in the game, they never fail to complement the tone of the specific stage that they're set to play in. For example, pay attention to the stage that this track first appears in. Now let's compare to a later stage where it's used again. The first stage feels like a typical sunny beach stage, whereas the second one feels more somber in its rainy setting. I think Jun Ishikawa did a great job making the soundtrack of the game so versatile. In short, the music is excellent. In fact, I'd say that it's an underrated classic, but that might be down to personal preference. Now how's the gameplay? Well, the gameplay is fairly standard for a Kirby game. You can inhale enemies and launch them as stars, or swallow certain enemies for copy abilities. You can also fly, swim, run, jump, fire a water gun underwater, all that normal Kirby stuff. You can also land on the ground with style. He always does that for some reason. It's like he knows he's being watched. This game is pretty easy as with most Kirby games, and it's very generous with lives. For a start, many of the stages have 1-ups in them, and there's this star gauge at the bottom of the screen. Whenever you fill it up, it gives you an extra life. To do that, you need to collect these stars, which are randomly placed throughout the stages. They're either out in the open or in these star blocks. Really, they're everywhere, so you'll have no problem filling up the gauge. All of this means that you'll never run out of lives as you're completing the game. Strangely, whenever you reset the game and load your save file, it resets your lives back down to the default too. Well, I guess saving lives is not a priority. The game is also bizarrely stingy at times with health items. As an example, in Kirby Superstar, the stages are littered with food items, which you can use to restore your health. These don't exist in Kirby's Dream Land 3, except for the energy drink and the Maxim Tomato. Man, at times I was desperate for a health item, but I always died before I could find one. Thankfully, the enemies aren't all that threatening for the most part. The real challenge is from where the enemies are placed rather than the enemies themselves. The enemies are placed in the stages in such a way that dealing with one naturally flows with confronting one or more enemies. This ensures that you have a consistent pace throughout every stage. Or you could just fly over them, I guess. Yes, I have to admit, that is a flaw with the gameplay. It doesn't happen all the time, but there are sections in the game where you can just fly over every enemy, and in those cases they're more like obstacles than enemies. Additionally, these sections often feel like different variations on the same hallway. I can't deny that this makes going through the stages feel a bit stale at times. To compound to this, the pacing of the game is pretty slow compared to most other games in the Kirby series. As an example, in Kirby Superstar, Kirby is very responsive and he does something as soon as you press a button. On the other hand, in Kirby's Dream Land 3, every time you press a button, there seems to be an ever so slight delay when Kirby does an action. I don't know how much delay there actually is, but it is definitely perceptible when playing the game. Also, sometimes the camera doesn't go that far ahead of you like it's supposed to, and if you rush ahead when this happens, then you're likely to slam into an enemy. Between this, the repetitive hallways, and the sluggishness of the controls, you'd be forgiven if you felt that the game was a little tedious. Perhaps a more generous term would be leisurely. This is speculation, but maybe the game is slow for the express purpose of giving the player more time to get charmed with the whole aesthetic and feel of the game. This strategy is effective, otherwise I wouldn't be talking about this game. Unfortunately, the gameplay is a little lacking as a result of this design philosophy. To clarify, I'm not saying that the gameplay is bad here, just that it could be much more polished. At least the enemies are interesting. Take these Wapods for example. I really like the genie look they have going on, and you have to destroy the jars, otherwise they respawn. There's also these little witch enemies too. Whenever you inhale them, you inhale their broom instead and they go tumbling to the ground. The best part is they're called Kiki, spelt K-E-K-E, which I guess is supposed to be an homage to Kiki's delivery service. These big caboos are kinda funny. They bark for some reason, which is kinda creepy actually. There's also... Jesus! Who is that? It's always out of reach for some reason, and it looks kinda like Kirby. Speaking of being like Kirby, you can exchange your 5th health chunk in order to summon a helper called Gooey. He has pretty much the same abilities as Kirby, but I personally don't find him all that useful. His AI is very limited for one, and even though he is supposedly capable of using copy abilities, he never does so. Worst of all, he keeps running into obstacles, so he gets left behind easily and dies quickly. Luckily, the developers accounted for this, and whenever you go too far ahead of him, he teleports to your location. If you don't want him around after you've summoned him, then you can inhale and swallow him to restore your 5th health chunk. Of course, why would you want to summon this mindless idiot in the first place? Well, for one thing, the game is programmed so that he never takes your last half of a health chunk whenever you summon him. So whenever you're near death, you can just summon Gooey and swallow him to restore a full health chunk. Pretty useful in a pinch. He can also be controlled by a second player, and I reckon the game could be really fun with him around if this was the case, but I can't attest to this, because I have no friends.
I'm so lonely, so lonely, so lonely inside real Rome.
They also simplified the copy ability system from Kirby Superstar. If you wanted to get rid of your copy ability in Kirby Superstar, you had to go through this long-winded process of turning your power into a partner, even if you didn't want one. And trust me, the partners in Kirby Superstar are just as brain-dead as Gooey. Thankfully, they allow you to abandon your equipped copy ability in Kirby's Dream Land 3 by pressing the select button. It's a very welcome addition. Also, unlike in Kirby Superstar, where the copy abilities had a varied moveset, the copy abilities in Kirby's Dream Land 3 only have one attack. There's technically 9 copy abilities in the game, but you only really get the last one at the very end of the game. So functionally, there's only 8 copy abilities that you'll be using throughout the game. This sounds really limited until you realize that you can combine your copy abilities with your animal friends. Now let's talk about your animal friends. There's Rick, Kine, Koo, Choo Choo, Nago, and Pitch. That sounds like a lot of baby babble, but trust me, they're a lot more than that. For starters, each of them have unique characteristics on how they control. Take Rick for example. He can't fly, but he can wall climb. For some reason, he can jump on enemies too to kill them, which can be pretty useful in niche situations. He also can't suck, but he does do this adorable thing where he keeps his mouth open, hoping that something goes in there. Nice. Kine also can't fly, but he can jump pretty high, and his fins can damage enemies, but don't rely on that because the hitboxes on the fins are pretty small. He also has much better mobility than all the other characters in the water, and he can swim against strong currents. As a side note, I find it kind of funny how Kirby pokes out of his mouth, like one of those creepy fish tongue parasites. Koo can fly, and if you press the fly button with a direction button, then he dashes in the air in that direction. This can be a pretty fast way to move around the stages, and you can use this to pass strong air currents too, but be careful of smashing into obstacles. Choo Choo lays on Kirby's head and aww, he looks like he loves it. You can't really fly with her, but you can slow your descent by pressing the jump button. You also can't suck with her, but you can use her tentacle to grab anything in front of Kirby. She can also use those tentacles to walk on the ceiling. Nago rolls Kirby around like a ball, as if he owns him. That's very in character for a cat. He also has this nice triple jump. Pitch's mobility is the same as Kirby's. It's kinda funny how whenever they dash, Kirby rides on his back. He barely fits and I half expect Pitch's legs to snap under the weight. One of my favorite things about these animal friends is whenever you pick one, all the other ones react badly to the rejection. Nago in particular is hilarious. There's just so much personality on display. So that's 6 animal friends altogether. If you combine that with the 8 standard copy abilities in the game, then that's 48 copy abilities excluding the final one. That's a lot of choice, although I'll admit that they're not all made equal. If you combine the parasol ability with Rick, you get this attack where Rick bounces Kirby on a parasol. Supposedly, it's one of the most powerful attacks in the game, but it's so impractical. For a start, the hitbox is exclusively above you, but you'll need to be moving forward most of the time. Worst of all, it kills your momentum because it stops you dead in your tracks. Despite all of that though, I can't bring myself to hate it because it's so adorable and wonderfully animated. In fact, it's very obvious from looking at these that the developers put a lot of thought and effort into making these animal friend copy abilities charming. By far the most inspired animal friend copy abilities are the ones from the cleaning copy ability. This is one of the few games where Kirby gets the cleaning copy ability, and it leads to some really interesting results. Unfortunately, it's generally the case that you're better off using Kirby on his own from a gameplay perspective. He has the most versatile mobility in the game, meaning that he'll have no problems traversing the stages. Still, I find myself playing with the animal friends a lot since they're so charming. I mean, here, look at this. I didn't mention this before, but whenever you enter a level, the game shows you a short cinematic where Kirby hangs out with the animal friends. Not only do you see more of their personality, but you even get to see their group dynamics. For a game that's really light on story, the characters feel so distinct and alive. These guys even have their own friends and loved ones. Oh, what's that? That's a heart star. On that note, all of the stages in the game, apart from the bosses, have an optional side quest to complete where you'll need to help someone. If you look at the little portraits before you enter a stage, you can see who you need to help and sometimes get a hint on what you're supposed to do. If you successfully complete a side quest, then you receive the heart star for that stage. Generally, the first stages of a level involves flowers, the second stages involves having to use an ability, the third stages involves a minigame, the fourth stages are search and rescue missions involving mid-bosses, the fifth stages involves bringing an animal friend to the end of the stage and reuniting them with a loved one, and the sixth stages involve a collectathon or destroying star block structures to make a shape. Usually the stages will have what you need to complete the side quests, with one notable exception. It can be a little annoying sometimes when you lose something that you need for a particular side quest, because that necessitates a do-over. Some of these side quests can require you to do some pretty interesting stuff. Take this stage for example. Here you need to complete a bunch of rooms to collect parts for a very familiar looking robot. You'll need to have access to a few different copy abilities and animal friends. Thankfully, there's a section nearby with all the copy abilities and animal friends that you'll need. We'll be going with Kine and the Spark ability for this one. Why do you ask? Well, for starters, because it's really cool. I mean, look at it. It's a freaking light bulb. Normally, you'd have to guess which doors to go through to progress here, but if you use the light bulb ability, then lo and behold, it indicates which one you're supposed to go through. Now, I admit that this is a bit obscure to figure out firsthand, since there's no prior indication that the light bulb power does this. Some of the worst side quests are the minigames in the third stages. They normally require you to memorize certain patterns, and they can get pretty challenging, especially if you have the memory of a goldfish like me. There's 3 rounds for all of these minigames, and if you fail just one of these rounds, then you're going to have to restart the stage, as you've failed the side quest. Worst yet, each round increases in speed, so you'll have less time to memorize the patterns. As you're going through the levels, every minigame you encounter involves something visual. So by the time you reach the final minigame, you're primed to expect a visual activity. While Chef Kawasaki has different plans, he decides to be extra cruel and do a sound activity, so if you're not paying attention then too bad, because you're gonna have to restart the stage. If it's not clear by now, there are a few side quests in the game that are a bit difficult to figure out quickly. That means you'll often find yourself figuring out what to do when it's already too late, which means you'll be repeating the stage. At least the game plays a jingle whenever you stumble upon something that is related to a side quest. It does help that some of the tasks can be humorous. For example, normally you need to help the flowers for the first stages in each level, but here, for some reason, there are mushrooms that live here, and they hate the flowers. They demand that you trample on every flower. It makes me want to know what kind of feud they had going on with the flowers before Kirby came here. What could have possibly caused all this animosity? Look at his dead eyes as he congratulates you with the heart star. Who hurt you, Mr. Mushroom? You wouldn't think it, but sometimes the tasks can be pretty relatable too. Here you need to bring Choo Choo to this green guy and have her do the tentacle grab move on him. Man, he loves being touched by a girl. He's just like me. Except I'm not green. And I haven't been touched by a girl. All in all, while some of the side quests can be a little annoying to complete, they do add much needed variety to what would otherwise be repetitive gameplay. Honestly, you'll get a lot more out of the game if you do all the side quests and collect all the heart stars. Besides, why wouldn't you want to help these little guys out? And you won't be able to cleanse each area of the dark magic corruption without doing so anyway. This cleansing only happens when you collect all of the heart stars for a level, and then beat the boss. If you're missing a heart star, then you'll need to go back, collect the missing heart stars, and then beat the boss again to cleanse the level. I've just mentioned the bosses a few times, so we might as well have a look at them. Firstly, there's the mid-bosses, but they're not much to write home about. They do basic attacks and you can eat them for copy abilities. Moving on, the first boss of the game starts off pretty standard with the classic Wispy Woods. I can't think of a single Kirby game that I've played where he doesn't feature in some capacity. To be fair, he is a little different in this game. Normally in most games, he stays in place while he launches projectiles at you. However, in this game, he gets really angry and chases you once you deplete half of his health. Too bad this anger is impotent, since he's a pretty easy boss. Things start to get a little weird though once you reach the second boss. It's an orca. Imagine fighting an orca. The best part is, his name is Acro, which is literally orca spelt backwards. His first phase is pretty simple. All he does is he tries to ram you. Once you damage him enough, he takes you underwater. If you don't have a copy ability, then you can knock back the projectiles that he launches at you using Kirby's water gun attack. This is pretty annoying though, as you have to angle yourself properly, otherwise the projectile goes flying nowhere near Acro. One of the things that they launch at you is smaller versions of themselves. Are those its babies? What a merciless parent. The third bosses are Pon and Con. Pon is the brown raccoon and Con is the yellow fox. They look like harmless pranksters rather than menacing foes, which is apt considering that they're simple bosses. All they do is run around with smaller versions of themselves, while bombs periodically fall onto the stage. You can actually inhale and launch the little ones at Pon and Con. Are those little ones their children? Are they relatives? Seriously, what is it with this game and its casual disregard for the safety of the young? And then there's Ado, and she's a very unique boss. She's a painter, as you can tell, and she draws creatures to fight you. All in all, you go through 4 rounds of drawn creatures to fight. She even draws Krakow at one point, who despite the name, isn't a perennial drug addict, and is in fact another staple of the Kirby series like Wispy Woods. When she runs out of things to draw, she gets all frustrated and she jumps down to rush you with her brush, but you can blast her away with one hit. I like how utterly pathetic this is and how she tumbles away like one of those Kiki enemies. It's just adorable. Of course, this wouldn't be a Kirby game without a fight with King Dedede. His first phase is what you would expect with the jumping and the hammer and the inhaling. His second phase is pretty weird and disturbing though. His stomach can open to reveal a set of jaws, which he uses to try to bite you, but it's pretty easy to avoid, especially if you're on the opposite side of the screen. He can also form an eyeball in his stomach, which he uses to fire 3 dark orbs at you. If you don't have a copy ability, then you can inhale the dark orbs and launch them back at him, but this can be surprisingly tricky if you don't line up your shot properly. Now if you fail to collect all the heart stars, then the game goes to the false ending once you beat King Dedede. It's nice how it shows you the names of the enemies, but it's not that satisfying. No, if you want the real ending, then you'll need to cleanse all the levels of dark matter corruption. Once you do that, you'll unlock the Hyper Zone. And there's only one thing in the Hyper Zone: the final boss. The final boss of the game is the Master of Dark Matter, and its name is Zero. Unfortunately, the fight itself is underwhelming for a final boss. It becomes a fairly easy shoot-em-up section once you learn the pattern. For this fight, you get the last copy ability, which is called the Love Stick. Hey, I have one of those too. Mine doesn't shoot hearts though. While the final boss isn't that difficult, I do very much appreciate its design. He looks genuinely nightmarish in contrast to the game's dreamlike atmosphere. In fact, I've hinted at it a few times now, but there are definitely a few things that are a bit nightmarish in this game, like... And also, all of that slowly leads to the final boss of the game. It corrupted everything in a dreamland just as a real nightmare would to a dream. Just look at this thing. It's like one of those kids' drawings that you see in a horror film, where everything looks nice and innocent, but then you notice that there's something horrifying that doesn't fit. Upon their defeat, all is right again in the world of Popstar. Your reward is the true ending of the game, where you're presented with some wonderful sketches of the characters that you've encountered throughout your journey. I really can't think of a more apt capstone to the game, since they encapsulate so much of the tone that you'll experience through your playthrough. So that's it. That's all there is to the game. Having listened to all that, you may be thinking, hang on, you basically listed off things that show the gameplay isn't anything spectacular. Why do you like this game again? Yes, it's true that the gameplay can be a bit repetitive and annoying at times, but it's more than passable. A video game isn't only its gameplay, even if it's regarded as the most important aspect in most cases. Things like presentation, music, and characterization can elevate a video game. And it's in these secondary areas that Kirby's Dream Land 3 shines the brightest. This game oozes charm. From the colorful world to the adorable inhabitants, this game never fails to put a smile on my face when I play it. And if you ever decide to play Kirby's Dream Land 3, I hope it brings a smile to your face too. Oh, I can't see. But wait. What? What the hell? Why is there so many of them?